The Auteur Classics come in at $1,500 and they're ZMF's replacement for the original Auteur, being called the Classic because they're kind of picking up on the classic sound of the Auteur as I understand it. In some ways it's a little bit confusing because the Classic sounds like the original when these are actually the new ones, but you kind of get the idea. At $1,500, the Classics are up against some pretty tough competition in the form of headphones like the HEADPHONE Arya Stealth, so I was really curious to see if they could stack up, whether maybe they had a nice point of difference to separate them from the Arya, and I'll cover all of that in this review. Before we get there though, let's talk a little bit about what the Auteur Classic is all about. Firstly, it's replacing the original Auteur, so it's picking up on many of the themes of the original, but with a new tuning, a newly designed driver, but otherwise a fairly similar sort of headphone. As is the case with most ZMF headphones, it's a 300 ohm dynamic driver being used here. It's got a sensitivity rating of 96 decibels per milliwatt, and that means it'll achieve 110 decibels with about 25 milliwatts, so it's actually pretty easy to drive. The driver being used in the Auteur Classic is a biocellulose design, so that's along the same lines as what's being used in the Atrium Closed, and what was used in the original Auteur. Generally speaking, biocellulose drivers deliver a slightly more organic sound, and that's not because they're an organic material, that's just coincidence. It's about the fact that the biocellulose material is somehow able to impart a slightly softer tonality to the sound. It doesn't mean it can't be fast and agile or resolving and have a sense of attack, but at the same time, it doesn't have the same sense of kind of attack and speed and therefore lightness of weight in the notes as something like a beryllium driver from the Verite Open. While we're talking about the design of the headphones, a few other things worth noting, and I've talked about this previously, is that the ZMF headphone range in the current form are some of the most comfortable headphones around. And apologies if you watched my recent reviews of the Atrium Closed or the Caldera where I've already covered this, but what makes these so comfortable and enjoyable for long periods of listening is that they use a combination of a leather suspension band here, which is a nice thick supple leather, and then also a padded headband with these special little wedges of foam to help disperse the weight evenly across the head. From there, we've got the headband, which is also a little bit bendy in that direction. That's then attached to these rods to allow adjustment up and down for the height of the headband. And then you've got plenty of swiveling action both forwards and backwards, as well as up and down for the cups, so you can get a really good seal. The final step then is these pads, which are always thick and plush from ZMF. Unless you get thin pads, of course, then they're thin but still plush. And either way, they're very, very comfortable. The cups on the Auteur Classic are made of this beautiful timber, as with most, if not all, ZMF headphones. And I say most because occasionally you do get the resin designs where it's a combination of wood and resin, but here we're looking at a pure timber version. No doubt there will be versions released in the future, if not already, that have either stabilized timber or the combination of the timber and the resin. And if you're not familiar with stabilized timber, it's where they're basically injecting dyes and resin potentially, I'm not sure, but they're injecting the timber to help to stabilize it and give it color. And it makes for a beautiful looking headphone, much like my Atriums that I've shared on the channel before. I'm personally not as much a fan of the look of the Auteur Classics as I am, say, the Verite Open or the Atriums, and that's largely because it's a much smaller grille, but it's one of those things where some people will love this, others will prefer the larger grills on the other models, and others again won't care at all, and it's all about the sound for you. And we'll get to the sound in just a second, but before we do, for those not familiar, the other things worth mentioning is that all ZMF headphones use a 4-pin XLR, mini XLR on the bottom of each cup, and they come with cables that are fine, but I do generally recommend getting a slightly better cable. Getting yourself a copper Litz cable can really help to bring out that last little bit of detail and resolution from your ZMF headphones. Now that could be a ZMF cable, they do sell them on the website, or an aftermarket one, I'll leave that entirely up to you. The final thing to mention about the design and comfort of these is that they're 490 grams, so that sounds pretty heavy, and in the scheme of headphones it is rather heavy, but they're incredibly comfortable. I've worn them for extended listening sessions all day sometimes when I'm doing editing and video calls and the like, and they're completely comfortable throughout the day. So don't worry too much about the weight, everything else comes into play to make sure that they are completely comfortable. Moving on then from the comfort, and let's talk about how they sound. If you're trying to work out what piece of gear you should buy next, then the Passion for Sounds Recommends database might be helpful for you. In the description box of every single video, just down here, you'll find the Passion for Sounds Recommends section. If you click on this link, it'll take you through to the Passion for Sounds Recommends Airtable database. What you'll see in here is every single product that I've ever reviewed and recommend, in some cases products that I own but maybe haven't reviewed but recommend. And then once you're in here, you can use the filter button up here to decide to filter by things like whether or not the product type is for a headphone, for example. So maybe you're looking for a headphone, filter it by that, and you can now see every headphone I recommend. You can sort it by price, which is the default sorting, or any other sorting method that you want. And then once you've got the list of products you're looking for, you've got the links to the reviews of the products, and then also purchasing links for global retailers and also regional retailers for the US, Australia, Canada, and the UK. So feel free to play around with this, sort it, filter it however you want to. It won't affect what anybody else sees, and you can hopefully find just the right products for you. I hope this is helpful, and now let's get back to the review. I think these could be one of the best combinations of a neutral, editing, mixing, mastering, reference type headphone along with a music listening headphone that I've tried. Another headphone that comes to mind that is quite good in that space is the Meze 109 Pro, but I don't think that's quite as honest in some ways as the Auteur Classics. And I will come back around to some comparisons in a little while, but let's start off by talking about just the sound of these on their own. The first thing to note is you've got very well extended treble, but very well controlled treble. Likewise, the mid-range is well balanced, it's got presence and body, but it's in no way thick or overly warm or rich. And in fact, the Auteur Classics are extremely good for me on both male and female vocals. They really let you kind of focus in on the vocal without pushing it really forward. They just make it present and available, and that's where I find them also very, very neutral, very natural, and great for editing. The bass content from the Classics is punchy and tight. It's got a good sense of weight to it. The extension down deep isn't exceptional, but it's also not bad. Like with most ZMF headphones, there is some roll-off down the bottom, and that's something that Zach talked about on my podcast episode with him. He talked about the fact that he tunes most of his headphones to actually roll off in the sub-bass. But the good thing is that it's done gradually, so the bass doesn't fall off a cliff, it just rolls off really gently, and so what you'll find is that they don't enhance sub-bass, but you also don't feel like there's a big hole in the sub-bass either. Unless you're listening to something that's got a prominent 20Hz focus, you're really not going to notice the roll-off from the Auteur Classics. And so ultimately, everything coming out of these just sounds like it should. Nothing stands out as being enhanced or pulled back or out of balance with anything else. Everything just sounds natural and honest. In isolation, they also have fantastic detail retrieval for the price point. They're not going to compete with your $3,000 plus headphones, but certainly at $1,500, I didn't feel like I was missing anything. But where they probably do start to have some weaknesses is that they don't have a particularly large soundstage. They're relatively good left to right, but there's not a lot of depth from the Auteur Classics. They're fairly two-dimensional. Now, funnily enough, that can actually be a benefit for editing, mixing and mastering, etc., because everything's very available. There's nothing kind of sitting back away from you in the mix. But I would say that for music listening, it is a little bit of a drawback. And we'll hear how that plays out in the comparisons with headphones like the Arya shortly, but it's worth taking into account if you're all about depth in the soundstage, these might not be the very best choice. Alongside that lack of depth in the soundstage, what that also means is that there's not a great deal of layering of sounds. Because there's not a lot of depth to work with, you won't necessarily hear the fact that in a recording, say the musician, the vocalist I should say, is standing in front of a drum kit and maybe a guitarist is sort of a little bit back and off to the side. You're going to be less able to pick out those details. What you'll hear instead is that it'll sound a bit like maybe the vocalist is standing right up against the drum kit, which is not very natural. And you'll then have a guitarist that will still be off to the sides. That part's done really well, but you won't have a sense of the depth in relation to the other instrumentation. So it is a little bit of a drawback. I think technically it's where the Auteur Classics don't perform quite as well as the more expensive ZMF headphones. But I should also stress it's not at all bad. It wasn't until I sat down and tried to specifically define the soundstage width and depth in my listening notes, it wasn't until then that I kind of noticed that there were any shortcomings. For normal listening, everything just sounded good and, as I've already said, natural and honest. And what all of this means is that they're a headphone that's fantastic for any genre. Their natural or even neutral tonality means they're going to perform really well on classical. They can also handle things with a bit more groove and a bit more energy because they're not going to get too bright in the treble, and they do have a good sense of presence in the bass without being bassy. And so they're not going to kind of amp up the groove in anything. They're just going to give it to you as honestly as they can. And likewise in classical, they're very good tonally, but that lack of depth does mean your orchestra is not going to have the same sense of scale in terms of the forwards and backs, that Y-axis if you like. It's not going to present that quite as well as other headphones, but it's still going to be very enjoyable because everything sounds just right tonally. And so whilst it may sound like these are a bit mediocre from what I've just said because of that soundstage depth issue, they're really not. I think they're a fantastic headphone, but they're a headphone that you need to know what you're getting. You need to know what you want from them before you buy them. And to help with that, let's do a couple of comparisons now to really put them into context of what they're doing well, not so well, and where I think they're going to be really helpful for people. The first test I did, which I've already mentioned, was up against the HEADPHONE Arya Stealth. These are essentially exactly the same price, and you've got two wonderful headphones here. Listening to Englishman in New York by Sting with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, and the Auteur Classic sounded wonderful. As I've already discussed, it was a very left-right presentation, but the separation of sounds was fantastic. Sting's voice was very clearly separated from the orchestra. I could hear all the individual sounds, and they all sounded just right. The tonality of the vocal was natural. You could hear the combination of resonance and harmonics from Sting's chest and the natural resonance of our voices. But then also you could hear the breathiness and the texture that should be there without it being enhanced. The strings in the background, both the bowed strings but also the plucked strings, they had a lovely combination of attack and clarity, but also the warmth that you should get from an orchestra full of strings. And ultimately, everything was just wonderfully balanced. Again, the only knock I could level against the Auteur Classic was a slight lack of depth. There wasn't the sense of the layers of the orchestra or the sense that Sting was well in front of the orchestra. That was really the only thing missing for me. Moving over to the Arias, and they were immediately obviously brighter and airier sounding. In other words, there was a greater emphasis in the treble compared to the Auteur Classic. What that leads to is a vocal from Sting in this track that was a bit lighter, a bit thinner with a bit less presence, and I definitely prefer the weight and the presence from the Auteur Classic, keeping in mind that it is by no means a thick or weighty mid-range. We'll get to one of those in a little while. Instead, it was just a very honest sounding vocal. I keep using that word honest, and I'm sorry if I keep repeating myself. It's just the best way I can describe these. They sound so true to life, they sound tonally so accurate, that if that's what you're looking for, it's very hard to go past them. However, if you're looking at what the best value is for you in this price point, where the Aria did start to pull ahead for me was that it has better layering. I was able to hear more of the scale of the orchestra from the Aria, and in some ways it separated sounds out more, partly because of that extra treble energy, and so some might say that it sounds less coherent, and I wouldn't disagree, whilst others would say that it separates the sounds better and lets you hear all the individual elements of the orchestra better, and I wouldn't disagree with that either. I think this is one of those where it's going to be entirely subjective. I think both have their merits, but those looking for that kind of separated sound experience where you can pick out each individual element of a soundscape, whatever that might be, that's where the Arias do pull ahead of the Auteur Classics. Another thing that stood out to me from the Auteurs was they had a better sense of bass impact, particularly right down low. So whilst the Arias I kind of consider as being a steady tilt from bass up through treble, they've got a lovely sense of bass depth and extension and weight despite that extra treble. And so those that like deep bass, but also want a fairly neutral sound, that's where the Arias can come into play and are probably a little bit better than the Auteur Classic. But if you want what I would consider to be a truly neutral and natural sound, I think the Auteur Classic get it right, whereas the Aria does stray a little bit too much into that treble emphasis. Both are wonderful though, it's going to be very subjective. Do keep in mind that the Aria can get a bit more fatiguing because of that extra treble, and that's going to depend a little bit on the amplification and the DAC you're using, and so that could be another splitting point. If you want a more relaxed listen, a more natural tonality, the Auteur Classic's the choice, giving up a little bit of staging depth as a result. But if you want a bit more energy, a bit more excitement, a bit more separation, then that's where the Arya steps in, that's the Arya Stealth specifically. But do keep in mind, it could come with a bit of fatigue. But then as I looked around my headphone collection, there was another headphone that really stood out to me. It's at the same price again as the Arya Stealth and also the Auteur Classic, and that's the Sendy Peacock. This is quite a mid-range focused headphone. It's not dissimilar to the Auteur Classic, but it leans a little bit more into mid-range focus. And listening to Bright Lights by Matchbox 20, the sound from the Peacocks was very articulate and very clean. The Peacocks push the mids and the upper mids forward a little bit compared to the Auteur Classics, and it can make their bass sound a little bit lean in comparison, even though I think the bass is probably comparable between the two. It's more the emphasis in the mid-range for the Peacocks that changes their overall tonality. It's not bad by any sense, I thoroughly enjoy them, and that's why I've kept them on my wall, but I think compared to the Auteur Classics, it's got a slightly leaner and more articulate sound. Very slight, but it's definitely there. And therefore going over to the Auteur Classics, the sound got smoother, but no less detailed. There was less sense of that articulation, less sense of that leanness, but it wasn't a lack of resolution. Interestingly, the planar magnetic driver of the Peacock delivered a bit more sense of punch down low, a bit more sense of weight or slam you might call it. And that's funny because both of these actually have very, very similar tonal response or frequency response. But I think just the different types of drivers and the way they move the air means that the Peacock did seem to just hit a little tiny bit harder down low. On the other hand, the Auteur, once again, is that little bit smoother, and this goes back to what I said earlier about the biocellulose drivers being very organic sounding. And so the Auteur Classic is going to give you a fairly similar experience with a little bit less articulation, a little bit less sense of mid-range forwardness if you like, but at the same time it's not going to have quite the same sense of articulation as the Peacocks or that deep slam in the bass. Neither are particularly bassy or slammy headphones, but the Peacock just edges ahead ever so slightly there. At the same time, the Peacock's emphasis in the upper mids can mean that they're a little bit less forgiving, and therefore they could be a bit harsher on harsher systems or harsher recordings, but both are very enjoyable headphones that you can just pick up, put on, and thoroughly enjoy. Neither do a lot in terms of depth of staging. The Peacock's probably a slightly better, but it's not a big difference. And now I know some of you are going to be screaming out for a Focal Clear MG comparison, and unfortunately I don't have the Clear MG here anymore. In the end I decided to sell that and keep the Aryas and also the aforementioned Sendy Peacocks as my two reference points at this price. And that's not because the Focal Clear MG aren't fantastic. I just found myself preferring the Arya and the Peacock for the different things they offered. What I can tell you though is that if you're after a dynamic and fun and punchy sound, then I do think you're going to want to buy the Clear MG rather than the Auteur Classics. I don't have them here to compare them side by side, but I've got clear memories of the MG and they're a very different headphone. They're not as neutral, they're not as honest, but they're going to give you a better sense of staging depth, more sense of energy, more sense of punch in the bass. But it's going to come at the expense of that really natural tonality and particularly the very natural mid-range that you get from the Auteur Classics. So choose based on that. If you're a vocal lover, if you're coming from headphones like say an HD600, 6XX, 650, 660, S2 or S1, then the natural step for an upgrade from those is going to be the Auteur Classic. It's not to say the Auteur Classic sounds the same as those. The Auteur Classic has more treble energy there. It's going to be a little bit more neutral sounding, a bit less warm and smooth and mid-range focused. But it's a closer fit going from the HD6 series to the Auteur Classic than say something like a Clear MG. So that's the differentiation to make. If you're after energetic, fun, punchy, it's all about the Focals. If you're after natural and honest, then it's all about the Auteur Classics. But then that led me to one final comparison, and that was to see for those of you that might be looking at the Auteur Classics and then also the Atriums, seeing that they're using the same damping system, the same general driver technologies. They are different drivers, but the same technologies being biocellulose, a 300 ohm voice coil, etc. I thought some of you might be looking at it thinking, should I just get the Auteur Classics? Are they nearly as good as the Atriums? So I thought I'd fire up a comparison between the two. I put both of them on a tube amp for this test. By the way, my previous testing was all direct out of the Chord Hugo TT2. But this time what I did was I ran the TT2 into the Linear Tube Audio MZ3 because ZMF headphones generally sound wonderful with tubes. I know for a fact that the Atriums sound best on tubes. And so I put them both on the MZ3 for this. Listening to Here by Vast, and what I heard from the Auteur Classics first was they balanced that sense of crunch in this mix with body and solidity very, very well. As things carried on and the track gets a bit busier and a bit crunchier and more energetic, probably the only thing I would say about the Auteur Classics that I haven't already said is that I felt like on this track they weren't letting me separate as much the vocals from the rest of the music. It was harder to hear the lyrics through all the rest that was going on in the mix. And that's very much where the difference came when I went to the Atriums. And not only that, that was something that was a very clear step forward, was that the Atriums much better resolved the vocals. I could focus in on them better from everything else going on. But in addition to that, the Atriums have a very different sound. They're a much more coloured headphone. They're a fuller and richer sounding headphone. And the Atriums produce bass which has more sense of depth to it, more sense of body to it, but it does come across a bit slower. And what I mean by that is that the bass is a bit fuller, it's a little bit less tight and less punchy, and that lends it more body, but also a less sense of speed in some ways. I should add that the Atrium doesn't sound bad, but for those looking for that more neutral sound once again, that's where the Auteur Classic is so strong. The Atrium still delivers plenty of crunch and energy in this mix despite being warmer and fuller and maybe not quite as tight in the bass, and it also manages to resolve details and sounds that I wasn't noticing at all from the Auteur Classics. It's one of those things where once I listened to the Atrium, if I went back to the Auteurs, I could hear them, but they didn't separate those sounds out in the same way that the Atrium could. And so basically what this means for me is that the Atrium is the technically superior headphone in terms of its performance of its driver. It's able to resolve more detail, it's able to produce more space and separation in the soundstage, both width and depth. And really the only places that I feel like the Atrium Classics are stronger is if you're looking for that more neutral tuning, and maybe if you want a tighter bass experience. That's where they're better. Other than that, the Atrium, in my opinion at least, is absolutely worth the extra money. If you're looking at the two of them, they're completely different headphones, so choose based on whether you want neutrality at the expense of that soundstage depth, and maybe also at the expense of some separation, or if you want to go for that really coloured but very enjoyable, very musical and engaging experience, that's where the Atrium comes in. But before I wrap things up here, the one other headphone that I thought I should mention was the Meze 109 Pro. Now it's a significantly cheaper headphone than the Auteur Classics, but I happen to have them here when I first received the Auteur Classics. I've had to send them back now. But while I had the two together, I had a patron that asked me specifically for a comparison between the Auteur Classics and the 109 Pro, and what I heard really shocked me, and that is just that the 109 Pros are so exceptional. They do things that, to me, the Auteur Classics can't match, and that's in terms of pulling sounds out of space, out of nowhere, giving you that lovely sense of separation and clarity in the soundstage and depth in the soundstage. And so if you're looking for a pure musical enjoyment headphone, I still think the 109 Pros are an amazing choice. But it is worth keeping in mind, they do have that sort of treble emphasis that gives them a bit of that fun, a bit of that sparkle, and that's not going to be what some people are looking for. I know a few people do find it a bit fatiguing. And so it's not to say that the 109 Pros are hands down the best headphone and the better choice for everybody. If I was looking for a headphone to wear for extended periods and do things like editing, mixing, mastering, etc., then the Auteur Classics absolutely still have their place. If you're looking for just a fun, engaging musical listen, then maybe the 109 Pros are better. I think technically the 109 Pros are astounding. But having had both of them here on my desk for quite some time a while ago, what I found was that if I was editing my videos, if I was watching YouTube videos, doing anything that involved that sort of multimedia, just relaxed, doing whatever kind of work, that's where I'd reach for the Auteur Classics. If it was for pure music listening, or maybe it was predominantly music listening and then drifting into some editing, that's where the 109 Pros would come in. And so hopefully I've been able to paint a picture of where these sit in the scheme of things. I don't think they're a world beater as such. I don't think they're better than anything else out there. But for what they're doing, I think they're exceptional. And that is giving you a very natural, very honest representation of the music in a way that's not fatiguing, but also not rolled off and lacking in treble detail. And really the only thing that I can knock them for is that they don't give as much separation and space in the soundstage as I'd probably like. But as I've already said, if you're doing things like mixing, editing, multimedia watching, etc., you probably don't need that so much, and that's where these are great because they're so comfortable and so easy to wear, both physically but also sonically for very long periods. So hopefully that's helped you better understand the Auteur Classics. As always, I'll pop a link down below where you can go through and buy them if this sounds like the headphone for you. There's no affiliations from that link. I have no benefit if you buy them or you don't buy them. But it's a nice way to say thank you to Zach for sending out the headphones for me to review for you. I think this ends my run of some ZMF headphone content recently until such time as the new up-and-coming portable model comes out. And so very soon I'll be bundling these up, sending them back to Zach so he can send me out the new closed back, and I'll be sure to share that with you as soon as I can. And with that in mind, if you've enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos like this one, particularly that closed back ZMF kind of sub $1,000 portable headphone review, then make sure you hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.